I sat quietly for 3 days while my own family destroyed me in court. On the 4th morning, my lawyer said, "We have one witness." The door opened. No one breathed. "Welcome back to the channel. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to play it straight. They had every chance to walk away clean. They just chose the hard way." Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. My name is Gerald Arthur Malone. I am 67 years old. For 3 decades, I ran Malone and Associates, one of the most respected financial consulting firms in the state. I have advised senators. I have restructured corporations. I have sat on hospital boards and university endowments and quietly, carefully, kept the financial lives of powerful people from falling apart. And now I was being tried for fraud. Not just any fraud. The kind that made the evening news. The kind where reporters stood on the courthouse steps and spoke in grave, practiced voices about betrayal of trust, and elderly victims, and a man who used his position to prey on the vulnerable. The kind where your photograph, not a recent one, never a flattering one, gets plastered across every local channel for a week. The prosecution's theory was straightforward, that over a period of 8 years, I had systematically redirected client funds into a series of shell accounts, siphoning nearly $4 million from retirees and widows who had trusted me with their life savings. That I had falsified statements. That I had lied, charmed, and stolen my way through the golden years of people who could not afford to lose what they lost. It was a compelling story. It had all the ingredients a jury loves: a sophisticated villain, sympathetic victims, a paper trail that looked damning if you didn't know how to read it. The problem was that not a single word of it was true. I sat at the defense table on Monday morning with my hands folded and my face composed. My attorney, Diana Reyes, sat beside me. Sharp, meticulous, 43 years old, and with a kind of quiet ferocity that doesn't announce itself until it needs to. She had been the only one who believed me from the very first conversation. Everyone else had already decided. The prosecution called their first witness at 9:14 a.m. My son, Thomas Malone, walked to the stand in a charcoal suit I had never seen before. He was 40 years old and had my jawline and his mother's eyes, and he sat down with the practiced stillness of a man who had been coached carefully. He did not look at me, not once, in 2 hours of testimony. He told the jury that I had been erratic in the last few years, that I had made unusual financial decisions, that he had personally witnessed me transferring large sums of money on multiple occasions without explaining why, that he had been frightened for my mental state and had urged me to step back from the business. The prosecutor, a lean and ambitious man named Curtis Webb, nodded along like a pastor receiving confession. "And in your opinion, Mr. Malone," Webb said, tilting his head sympathetically, "was your father capable of understanding the consequences of his actions?" Thomas finally looked at me then, just for a moment. And in that moment, I saw something I had not expected. Not guilt, not sorrow, something colder than both. "No," he said. "I don't believe he was." Diana's hand moved slightly on the table beside mine. A small, deliberate pressure, a signal. "Stay still. Let it happen. We have time." I stayed still. I let it happen. I had time. Tuesday brought my daughter, Patricia. She was 3 years younger than Thomas, softer in her manner, harder in her convictions. She had always been the emotional core of our family, the one who gave the toasts at Thanksgiving, who remembered every birthday, who cried at the airport both when you arrived and when you left. I had always believed, with the certainty of a father's love, that Patricia would walk through fire for me. Instead, she walked to the witness stand and set me on fire herself. Her testimony was more devastating than Thomas's precisely because it sounded so reluctant. She dabbed at her eyes. She said she loved me. She said this was the hardest thing she had ever done. She described finding a notebook in my desk drawer. She had been looking for a pen, she said, that contained what she believed were records of secret transactions. She described overhearing a phone call years ago, where I had spoken to someone about moving the balance before the quarter closed. She described, in a voice that broke twice, how she had confronted me about it, and how I had laughed it off and told her not to worry. I should have pushed harder, she said. I should have gone to someone sooner. These poor people. She stopped. The jury watched her. 3 of them leaned forward. These poor people trusted him, she finished. Just like I did. Webb let the silence sit for 10 full seconds before he said, "No further questions." I looked at Patricia as she stepped down. I tried to find, in her face, some recognition of what was actually happening, some flicker of awareness of the truth. She looked away, and her husband touched her arm as she returned to her seat in the gallery, and he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as satisfied. His name was Derek Hollis. He had married my daughter 6 years ago. He was a real estate developer who smiled too easily and listened too carefully. Within 8 months of the wedding, he had been present at every family gathering, every business dinner, every casual conversation about the firm. Within 18 months, he had introduced me to 3 of the clients who were now listed as my victims on the prosecution's exhibit sheet. But Patricia didn't know that. Or perhaps she did, and had made her choice. Either way, I stayed still. If you already know where this is going, you've been here before. Follow true consequences so you never miss the moment the table turns. Wednesday was the affidavits. Webb submitted 11 signed statements from former colleagues, clients, even a woman who had done our bookkeeping for 2 years in the early days of the firm. Each one painted a consistent portrait, a man who had grown secretive, who discouraged oversight, who deflected questions about account balances with charm and authority. One of the affidavits came from a man named Robert Chu, who had been my closest friend for 26 years. We had coached Little League together. We had sat in the same hospital waiting room when each of our wives gave birth. He had been the best man at my wedding and the first person I called when my wife, Eleanor, was diagnosed with cancer 9 years ago. His affidavit said that I had borrowed $200,000 from him personally and never repaid it, and that when he had asked about it, I had become hostile and threatening. I read his words in the exhibit packet that Diana had handed me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not grief, but a strange, almost clinical clarity. Because Robert's signature on that document told me something important. It told me that whoever had orchestrated this had reached further than I realized. It told me that the pressure applied had been significant, and that meant they were afraid of something. Afraid of what I knew. Afraid of what I had. Diana leaned close to me during the afternoon recess and said very quietly, "They've played everything. They're done." "How does it look?" I asked. She considered the question with the honesty I had come to rely on. "If you were anyone else, I'd be worried. But," she almost smiled, "but I've seen what's in that file, Gerald. And tomorrow is going to be a very different kind of day. Let me tell you about Derek Hollis. I had been suspicious of him within 6 weeks of meeting him, which made me, according to Patricia, paranoid and controlling. I was a man who had spent 30 years reading financial documents and the people who produced them, and Derek Hollis had the particular quality of a man whose numbers never quite added up. Not in obvious ways, not in ways you could point to immediately, but in the way a room looks almost right after someone has been through it. Just slightly off. Just enough to notice if you knew what to look for. In the 2nd year of his marriage to my daughter, I had quietly asked a former colleague to run a background check. What came back was superficially clean. Derek Hollis, licensed real estate developer, no criminal record, 3 successful property developments, a modest but legitimate portfolio. But there was a gap. 3 years in his mid-30s that didn't connect properly. A business registered in Nevada under a slightly different name. A civil settlement. Sealed. An address that corresponded to the registered office of a company that had been dissolved under circumstances my colleague described as murky. I had filed this information away. I had said nothing to Patricia. I had watched and waited, the way I always did, because I had learned over 3 decades that patience is the most powerful instrument a careful man possesses. What I hadn't anticipated was that Derek was watching me too. Here is what actually happened because it is important that you understand it clearly. 3 years ago, Derek Hollis began quietly approaching my clients. Not overtly. Never overtly. He was introduced as Patricia's husband at events, as Gerald's son-in-law in conversations. He was warm, informed, financially literate in the way that reassures people who have money they're afraid of losing. He proposed alternative investment vehicles. He offered returns that were slightly, not absurdly, just slightly, better than what I was producing. 6 of my clients moved portions of their portfolios through structures Derek controlled. Those structures were fraudulent. The money moved, shifted, and partially vanished through a network of accounts that were designed to look, from the outside, like they originated with me. He had used my name, my reputation, my access, and he had built the trail carefully enough that every piece of paper pointed in one direction, toward me. When the investigation began, I had understood immediately what was happening. The question was not whether I was guilty. I knew I was not. The question was whether the truth could be proven in a courtroom, against the testimony of my own children, using only what I had quietly collected over 3 years of watching a man I had never trusted. I had told Diana everything in our first meeting. I had handed her a locked hard drive and a key, and I had said, "Everything you need is on this. Don't use any of it until the 4th morning." She had looked at me for a long moment. "You've been planning this defense since before you were charged." "I've been planning it," I said, "since the day he married my daughter." Thursday arrived the way consequential days often do, quietly, ordinarily, with the same gray light through the same courthouse windows. I wore my dark blue suit, the one Eleanor had bought me for our 35th anniversary. I had not worn it since her funeral, 3 years ago. I put it on that morning in my hotel room. I had not been home since the trial began, not wanting to be in that house with Thomas in the adjoining property, not wanting any of it, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. Eleanor would have found all of this extraordinary. She would have sat in that gallery every single day, and she would have looked at Thomas and Patricia with a particular expression she reserved for profound disappointment. Not angry, not wounded, just utterly, heartbreakingly clear-eyed. And she would have looked at me with the expression I had carried in my memory for 3 years since she left. "I know who you are. Get on with it." I straightened my tie. I went to court. Curtis Webb gave his closing remarks with the confidence of a man who believed the verdict was already written. He walked the jury through the exhibit trail one more time. The accounts, the transfers, the timeline, the testimony. He paused at the photographs of the victims. He named them individually. He was good at his job, and he had built a good case, and if I had been a juror sitting in that box I might well have believed it. When he sat down, Judge Okafor looked at Diana. "Ms. Reyes, the defense may call its witness." Diana stood. She buttoned her jacket. She turned toward the gallery with a composure so complete it was almost theatrical, and she said in a voice designed to reach every corner of the room, "Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Nathaniel Cross." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the entire room stopped breathing. Nathaniel Cross was 51 years old and walked with a slight limp from an injury he had sustained years ago that he never talked about. He was a compact, precise man in a gray suit, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that moved across a room the way a surveyor's instrument moves across terrain, measuring, recording, missing nothing. He had spent 22 years with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network before going private. He was, without question, the finest forensic financial investigator in the country. He had testified in 47 federal cases. He had never, in those 47 cases, been successfully challenged on his methodology. I had retained him quietly, 3 years ago, 2 months after Derek Hollis had first introduced my clients to his investment structures. I had paid him from a personal account that appeared nowhere in the business records. I had met with him 4 times a year, always outside the state, always in person. I had given him everything I had on Derek, the background check, the gap years, the Nevada registration, the sealed settlement, and I had said, "Build me the truth." He had spent 36 months building it. He took the witness stand with the ease of a man who had done this many times, settled his folder on the railing, and looked at Judge Okafor with professional deference. Diana approached him slowly. "Mr. Cross, please describe for the jury the nature of your investigation." What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of the most precise, methodical, and devastating financial testimony I have ever witnessed, and I have witnessed a great deal. Nathaniel Cross walked the jury through the architecture of the fraud with the clarity of a man explaining a building's blueprints. He traced the shell companies, 7 of them, registered across 3 states and 1 offshore jurisdiction, back to a parent structure controlled not by Gerald Arthur Malone, but by a holding company whose ultimate beneficial owner, after 3 layers of corporate structure, was Derek James Hollis. He presented bank records obtained through a parallel civil discovery process, records that showed the actual movement of funds, not the fraudulent trail that had been constructed to implicate me, but the real movement, the one that happened before the paper trail was manufactured. He introduced communications, emails, encrypted messages recovered from a server Derek had believed was private, in which Derek discussed, explicitly and in his own words, the strategy of using my name and reputation as a vehicle for the scheme. In one message, sent to a contact whose identity was still being established by federal investigators, Derek had written, "The old man's name is worth more than his money. Use it, and then let him hold the bag." The jury was absolutely still. Diana said, "Mr. Cross, in your professional opinion, based on 36 months of forensic investigation, did Gerald Arthur Malone commit the fraud described in this indictment?" Nathaniel Cross looked at the jury. He looked at each of them in turn, the way he always did, the way that made juries understand that this man was not performing, he was reporting. "No," he said. Gerald Malone was the target of this fraud, not its architect. Every piece of evidence pointing to him was manufactured. Every document, every account, every transaction was constructed to create that appearance while concealing the actual perpetrator. He paused. In 36 months of examination, I found not a single genuine connection between Gerald Malone and the movement of the funds in question. Curtis Webb's cross-examination lasted 23 minutes. He challenged the methodology. He questioned the sourcing of the communications. He suggested that the investigation had been commissioned by the defendant and therefore compromised by bias. Nathaniel Cross answered each challenge with the serene patience of a man who had anticipated all of them and found them insufficient. When Webb sat down, there was nothing left of the prosecution's case that a careful person would stand behind. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes. Not guilty on all counts. I sat in the courtroom after the room had mostly emptied and I held the verdict sheet in both hands and I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. I felt a deep, exhausted relief, the kind that comes not from winning but from finally being allowed to stop holding something heavy. And beneath that relief, a sorrow I had no words for yet. Thomas called me that evening. I did not answer. He left a voicemail, careful, stilted, the words of a man who had been advised by someone, perhaps a lawyer of his own, to make contact. He said he had not fully understood the situation. He said he hoped we could find a way forward. He said he was sorry. I listened to the message twice. Then I saved it to a folder I labeled Thomas, April, and I set the phone face down on the table. Patricia came to the hotel. I opened the door because she was my daughter and because, despite everything, I am not a man who closes doors on people he loves while there is still breath in the room. She stood in the doorway, and she looked smaller than I remembered her looking since she was a child. Her eyes were red. She had no speech prepared. Whatever she had planned to say had dissolved somewhere between the parking lot and the fourth floor, and what was left was just her face, open and wrecked and very young. "I didn't know," she said. "Gerald." "Dad. I swear to you." "I know," I said. "Because I did know." I had known from the beginning that Patricia was not a villain. She was a woman who had loved a man and believed him and been used by him, which is one of the oldest and most ordinary forms of devastation in the world. I let her in. We sat at the small table by the window. I made tea from the inadequate hotel kettle and we sat with it cooling between us, and she talked for a long time. About Derek, about the things she had begun noticing, about the questions she had started asking in the weeks before the trial that he had deflected so smoothly she had almost not noticed the deflection. "He told me you were in trouble," she said. "That the best way to help you was to cooperate. That if we defended you it would look worse." She pressed her fingers against her mouth. "I believed him. God help me, I believed him." "He's very good at being believed," I said. We sat together for a while longer. When she finally left, she held me for a long time in the doorway, and I held her back, and neither of us said anything, because some things can only be repaired slowly, in ordinary time, through ordinary days. Derek Hollis was arrested 11 days after the verdict. Federal charges: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The investigation that Nathaniel Cross had been feeding evidence to for the better part of a year had reached its conclusion, and the case, when it landed, was airtight in the way that cases built slowly and carefully over years tend to be. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard about the arrest. I want to be honest about that too. What I felt was closer to the feeling you have when you finally close a window that has been letting cold air in for a very long time. Not joy. Just the absence of the draft. Robert Chu came to see me 6 weeks after the verdict. He stood on my porch with a bottle of the scotch we used to drink on Friday evenings when the world was simpler, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something crushing for a long time. He had been approached, he told me, 2 years ago. He had been shown documents, fabricated ones I now understood, that had seemed to prove the fraud beyond doubt. He had been told that his cooperation would limit the damage to the family. He had signed the affidavit in the belief, genuine and terrible, that he was doing the right thing. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about 26 years. Little League and hospital waiting rooms and the best man speech that made Eleanor cry. I thought about what it costs a person to sign a document like that, believing it to be true, believing it necessary. "Come inside," I said. "I'll get glasses." We sat on the back porch until past midnight. We didn't talk about the trial for very long. We talked about his grandchildren, and about the summer being warmer than it should be, and about a fishing trip we had always said we would take and never had. Before he left, he said he was sorry, and I told him I understood, and both of those things were true. I returned to work 4 months later. Not to Malone and Associates, that was finished, dissolved. Its remaining clients helped to find new arrangements by Diana, who had billed me precisely what she had quoted and not a cent more. I started something smaller. A consultancy. Just me, a part-time assistant, and the kind of work I have always been best at. Sitting across from someone whose financial life is in disorder and helping them find the shape of it again. My first client was a 73-year-old widow named Margaret Cho, who had lost a significant portion of her retirement savings in one of Derek's structures. She came to me because, she said, she had watched the trial and she understood that I had been wronged too, and she thought that perhaps two people who had been wronged by the same man might be useful to each other. She was right. She sat across from me at my small desk, and I opened her file, and I began the work of putting something back together. That is, in the end, what I have always been best at. Not the confrontation, not the verdict, not the moment when the door opens and the room stops breathing. The quiet afterward. The patient, ordinary work of repair. The rest is just waiting. and I have always been very good at waiting. Justice doesn't always announce itself, but on True Consequences, it always arrives. Follow the channel. The next story is already waiting.